Hello and welcome to the next edition of the BriefingsDirect Voice of the Analyst podcast series. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at InterArmor Solutions, your host and moderator for this ongoing discussion on the latest insights into hybrid IT and cloud computing. Many of our ongoing discussions focus on infrastructure trends that support the evolving hybrid IT continuum. Today's focus shifts to behavior, to how individuals and groups, both large and small, benefit from cloud adoption. It turns out that a dark side to assessing cloud success points to a lackluster business outcome trend. And a large part of the disappointment has to do with outdated behaviors and persistent dissonance between what line of business practitioners can do and will do with their newfound cloud strengths. We'll now hear from an observer of cloud adoption patterns worldwide on why making cloud models a meaningful business benefit rests more with adjusting the wetware than any other variable. Here to help us explore why cloud failures and cost overruns are dogging many enterprises is Robert Christensen, Vice President, Global Delivery, Cloud Professional Services and Innovation at Cloud Technology Partners, an HPE company. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you for having me, Dana.
Glad to have you with us. So what is happening now with the adoption pattern of cloud that makes the issue of how people react or don't react such a pressing concern? What's making this come to a head now?
I think that enterprises are all on some cloud journey, right? They've started their investment. They've recognized that agility is a mandate for them, and they want to get those teams rolling, and they've already done that to some degree and extent. They may be, moving a few applications, or they may be doing a wholesale shutdown to data centers. They're in lots of different phases and adoption situations, and what we're seeing is the lack of progress with regards to the speed or the momentum of the adoption of those applications into the public cloud. It's going a little slower than they'd like.
Why is this different from the past? Why is there this dissonance between what people could do and are doing with technology? We've been through many evolutions, many generations, even step changes in technology, but most of them have been on a progressive direction. Why are we sort of catching our heels in the dirt now?
It's a completely different modality, Dana. One of the things that we've learned here is that adoption of infrastructure that can be built from the ground up using software is a whole nother way of thinking that has never really been the core bread and butter of an infrastructure or a central IT team. So the thinking and the process, the abilities to change things on the fly from an infrastructure point of view is just brand new way of doing things. And, we've had various fits and starts around that throughout history, but nothing at this level. Nothing that has actually been, the tool sets that are available today have just completely changed and redefined how we go about doing this stuff.
Because we're not really just changing a deployment pattern. We're really reinventing the concept of an application. Instead of monolithic applications and systems of record that people can get trained on and line up around, we're actually decomposing things into services, giving them catalogs, encouraging them to work across organizational boundaries because they can, and they have data and insights along the way that they never had before. So that really is something quite different. Even the concept of an application is up for grabs.
Think about this. Historically, an application team or a business unit, let's say in a bank, says, hey, I see an opportunity to reinvent how we do funding for auto loans. We worked with a company that did this. And historically, they would have to go to a whole bunch of and jump through a bunch of hoops to justify the investment of buying new infrastructure, setting up all these various components necessary, actually maybe landing new hardware in their organization, go through the procurement process. It typically, in the financial world, takes months to make that happen. Just to find out, are we investing and going in the right direction? So there's a lot of momentum behind there. So today, that same team, using a very small investment, can stand up a highly available, redundant data center in less than a day on a public cloud. In less than a day, using a software-defined framework. And now they can go iterate and test and be very, very low risk to see if that happens, if the marketplace is willing to accept that kind of solution that they want to offer. And that just blows apart every single procedural-based thinking that we've had up to this point. It just blows it apart. And that thinking, that way of looking at stuff is foreign to most central IT people. And because of that, the motion of our going to the cloud has become rather fits and starts. Some people are doing it really well. A majority of them are struggling because of the people issue.
Well, it seems ironic, Robert, because typically when you run into too much of a good thing, you slap on some governance. You put in some central command and control, and you sort of throttle it back. But right. That will subvert the benefit here. So how do you find a happy medium, or is there such a thing as a happy medium when it comes to moderating and governing cloud adoption?
Yeah, that's where the real rub is there, Dana. How do you keep us, let's think about this. Let's give it an analogy. We do these workshops, Cloud Technology Partners does these cloud adoption workshops where we bring in all the various teams and we try to knock down the silos so we can get these conversations going to address exactly what you just said. How do we put governance in place without getting in the way of innovation? Huge, huge problem, because the central team's whole job really at the end of the day is to protect the client, protect the brand of the company, the client data, and to keep it safe while giving the infrastructure necessary tools for the teams to go out and do what they need to do. When you have a structure like this, but it's now being supplied by the public clouds like Amazon and Google and Microsoft, you have the ability to put a lot of those controls now in software that were before done either manually or at least semi-manually in the past. The challenge is that the central teams not necessarily are set up with the skills to make that happen. They're not by nature software development people. They're hardware people. They're rack and stack people. They're people who understand how to stitch this stuff together, and they may use some automation, but as a whole, it's never been their core competency. So therein lies the rub. How do you convert these teams over to think that way? At the same time, you have the whole pressing issue of I'm going to automate myself right out of a job. That's the other part. That's the big what I call, Dana, what I call the bigger, 800-pound gorilla that's sitting in the corner that no one wants to talk about, is how do you deal with that fear?
Yes, and let's be clear, are we talking about private cloud, public cloud, hybrid IT, all of the above when it comes to these trends?
It's mostly public cloud that you're seeing the perceived threats. Let me make sure I'm clear on your question. The public cloud is perceived as, what's the word I'm looking for? It's perceived as the threat to the current standing way of doing IT today. If you are an internal IT person, let's say that you are a classic compute and management person. You actually spread across both storage and compute, and you're able to manage and handle a lot of those infrastructure servers and storage solutions for your organization. And you may be part of a team of 50 in a data center or a couple data centers. Much of those classic roles literally go away with a public cloud environment implementation. You just don't have a need for them. So these folks need to pivot or change or go into new particular roles or reinvent themselves. However, if you are, let's say you're the director of that group and you happen to be, 5, 7, 8 years away from retirement, this actually happened to me, by the way. There is no way these folks will want to give up the reins right before their retirement or their reinventing of they don't want to reinvent their role just before they're going to go, out the pasture and reinvent themselves. They literally said to me, I remember this one meeting I was in, I am not changing my career this far into it for the sake of a public cloud reinvention. So they're just hunkering down, building up the walls and slowing up the process. This seems to be an undercurrent in a number of areas where people just don't want to change. They don't want to make any differences.
Well, just to play the devil's advocate on that a little bit, when we hear things around serverless, when we see more automation being brought, when we see that AI ops and using artificial intelligence and machine learning to see patterns within an IT environment where the suggestions on whether to be a public or private or some combination or a multi-cloud and some combination are all being starting to really come to fruition, it does get sort of scary. It does get sort of like, well, maybe we do need to step back and ask, just because we can do something, should we do something? And is there more than just protecting my career here? Is there really a need for careful consideration before we leap into some of these new trends?
Yeah, so it's a hybrid world. Let's be clear, Dana. There's just a series of applications that may not make sense to be in the public cloud, right? There's legacy applications. There's a number of heavy lifting, what I call centers of gravity, that are database-centric. The business runs on, and moving them to and doing the big lift over to a public organization, public cloud platform may not make financial sense. There's no real benefit to it to make that happen. So we're going to be living between an on-prem and a public cloud environment for quite some time. The challenge that happens with that is people want to, at least from our perspective, the CTP perspective, and from my opinion as well, they see that I want to create a holistic view of that. How do I govern it in one view and one strategy? So that requires a lot more what you're talking about, a little bit more cautious view going forward. And that's a big part of what we have done at CTP, is help people establish that governance framework, how to put the automation in place to pull these two things together to make it more seamless. How do you network between the two environments? How do you create low latency communications between your sources of data and your sources of truth? And to make that happen, that's what we've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years now. The challenge we have, Dana, is that once we've established that, we call that a methodology, we call it a minimum viable cloud, and you put all that structure and that rigor and that security in place that you're talking about, we still run into the problems of motion and momentum. Those governance frameworks, they're well established. Go ahead.
Before we dig into why that inertia exists in ongoing sense, let's hear a bit more about Cloud Technology Partners. You were acquired by Hewlett-Packard Enterprise not that long ago. Tell us about what your role is. Just consultancy? Is it also some level of brokering? What do you guys do, and how does that fit into HPE?
So CTP was established as Cloud Technology Partners in 2010, and originally we were doing mostly private cloud OpenStack stuff, and we did that for about 2.5, 3 years, up to about 2013. I joined the company, one of the first 20 employees. It's a Boston-based company, and I came over with the intent of bringing more public cloud into the practice. We were seeing a lot of uptake at the time. I just came out of another company called Cloud Nation that I owned. I sold that company. It was an Amazon Citrix for rent company. So imagine, if you would, you swipe a credit card and you get your NetScalers and your Zen app and Zen desktops on top of Amazon back in 2012 and 2013. So I sold that company. I joined CTP, and then we grew the practice of public cloud on Google, Azure, and AWS over those years. Became the leading professional services, cloud-enabled professional services organization in the world. We were purchased by HPE this time in October last year, 2017. And my role since that time, has continued since that time, is to educate, evangelize, and press deeply into the methodologies for adopting public cloud in a holistic way so that it works well with what people have on-premise in conjunction with both those. And that includes the technologies, the economics, the strategies, the organizational change, the people, the security, establishing a DevOps practice in the organization. These are all within our world. We do consultancy, professional services, meaning that advisory, that type of thing. But on the same coin, we flip it over, we have a very large group of engineers and architects who are excellent on keyboards. So they are the people who actually write software and code to help make a lot of this stuff automated and move people to the public cloud.
All right, let's go back to this issue of there's so much that the cloud can accomplish. We recognize that this is a step change and not an iteration in terms of the evolution of computing. This is not going from client-server to web apps and end-tier. We're really talking about bringing services and processes into a company and refactoring that company. Because if you don't, the competition or a new upstart unicorn-type company is going to eat your lunch, and we've certainly seen plenty of examples of that. So what is it that is preventing organizations from seeing the potential and realizing the potential? Is this a matter of skills? Is it because everybody is on the cusp of retirement and you're just politically holding back? What can we identify as some of the obstacles to breaking that inertia down?
That's a great question. From my perspective and from the perspective of a number of our engagement leads, we're right in the thick of it. So whenever new programs are launched or in the middle of them, CTP has been involved with many, many Fortune 500 companies through this process. So when technology is ubiquitous, meaning that everybody in the marketplace can own pretty much the same technology now. Dana, this is a really interesting thought. If a team of 10 Stanford graduates can start up a company to disrupt the rental car industry, which somebody has, by the way, and they have access to technologies that was only reserved for those with hundreds of millions of dollars in IT budgets, you've got all sorts of other issues to deal with now, right? So what's your competitive advantage? It's not access to the technologies. The true competitive advantage now for any company today is the people and how they consume and use the technology to solve a problem. Before, it was reserved for those who had access to the technology. That's gone away. We now have a level playing field. Anybody with a credit card can spin up a big data solution today. And that's amazing. That's truly amazing. So when an organization who's always has fallen back onto their big iron or their infrastructure, those processes that they have as their competitive advantage, that now has become a detriment to them. There's now the thing that's slowing them down. It's the anchor that's holding them back and the processes that are around it. So that rigidity of the people and the process that's locked into the doing the same thing over and over again is a serious obstacle. That's the first one. The second one is this, and this one came out very much as a surprise, Dana, over the last couple of years when we were doing the application assessments for the inventory for people who were considering shutting down data centers. They were looking at the assets, holding the assets of data centers as not competitive. And they said, hey, can we shut down a data center and move a lot of it to public cloud? And so we were hired as CTP to go do what are called application assessments, economic evaluations. Is there a cost validation for this, for doing a lift and shift? And the number one obstacle was inventory. The CMDBs, which are the inventory of where all the servers are and what's running on them, for these organizations were wholly out of date, so many of these CMDBs just didn't give us an accurate view of it. And then when it came time to understand what applications were actually running behind the four walls of the firewalls in the data centers, nobody really knew. As a matter of fact, nobody really knew what applications were talking to what applications or how much data was being moved back and forth. They were so complex. We were talking about hundreds, if not thousands of applications intertwined with themselves, sharing data back and forth, and nobody inside the organizations understood which applications were connected to which, how many there were, which ones were important, and how they worked. Years of managing of that world has created such a spaghetti mess behind those walls that it's been exceptionally difficult for organizations to get their hands around what can be moved and what can't. So this is also creating tension in the system. And then throw on top the third part, people not wanting to change their behaviors or really kind of locked into that day-to-day motion of how they maintain the systems, not really motivated to go do that. Now you've got this trifecta of obstacles to cloud.
Yeah, they can find lots of reasons to push off to another day, rather than get into that spaghetti, because that's hard work. It's very difficult.
It's crazy.
I sympathize with it, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you and I, we came out of that whole the three motions here of technology, and the last ones have been the virtualization. That was hard enough just virtualizing, let alone trying to pull it apart.
Right. It didn't solve the problem. It just sort of paved a cow path, got some efficiency, reduced poor utilization, but you still have that spaghetti. You still have those processes that can't be lifted out. And it's not just lifting and shifting the infrastructure. It's lifting and shifting a process. And if you can't do that, then you're stuck. Other types of companies facing issues of, incumbency, let's just leave it at that. Incumbency can come with many downsides. Said, okay, we're going to create a skunk works. We're going to create a division within the company, create a seed organization, and reinvent ourselves, and maybe start subsuming other elements of the company along the way. Is that what the cloud and public cloud utilization within IT is doing, and why wouldn't that take off? Why is there an inertia for those POCs and for that skunk works approach to start subsuming and eventually overcoming the inertia?
That's a great question, and I immediately thought of a client who we helped just recently in the last 4 or 5 months. They have a separate team who's rewrote or rebuilt an application using serverless on Amazon. And it's a fairly significant revenue generator for them. And they did it almost 2.5 years ago. It's got a few servers in it, but mostly they use the messaging backbones and non-server-based PaaS layers of Amazon to solve this problem. And they're a consumer credit company, and they have a lot of client or customer-facing applications that generate revenue from them on this new platform. And it was a solution that was run, and the team kind of educated themselves. They were forward thinkers. They saw the changes in public cloud. They were giving them advantage. And they got permission from the business unit and to break away from the central team's standard processes, and they completely redefined the whole thing. The team really, really nailed it and knocked it out of the park. So high success. They were able to hold it up, and they tried to bring that success and all that thinking back into the broader IT group. The IT group, on the other hand, felt that they wanted more of a multi-cloud strategy. So they weren't going to have all their eggs in Amazon. They wanted to have, give the teams, the central team felt that they needed to give the business options, either go to Amazon or Azure, or even Google for that matter. And they wanted to be able to still have a uniform plane of compute for on-prem. So they brought in Red Hat's OpenShift. And they overlaid that, and they built out a platform to do that. Now, the Red Hat platform, I personally have had no direct experience, but I've heard good things about it. I've heard people adopt it and see benefits. This particular environment, though, Dana, the business units themselves rejected. The core team, the Amazon core team, said, we're not doing that because we're skilled in Amazon. We're understand this. We're going to use CloudFormation. We're going to write code to the applications. We're going to use Lambda whenever we can. And they said, no, we're not doing that. Other groups were saying, hey, we're an Azure shop. We're not going to be tied up around Amazon because we don't like the Amazon brand and all that political stuff. And they just went to Azure and decided to go shooting off on their own and did not use the OpenShift platform for that because at the time the tool stacks were not quite there what they needed to solve some of the problems. And so they ended up getting this fractured view of the whole place. And we recommended that they go on a education path to really bring people up on what OpenShift could do for them. And unfortunately, they opted not to do that, and they're still wrestling with this problem. We believe, CTP and I believe personally, that this was an issue of education, Dana. An issue of education, not technology, not opportunity, but they needed to really lean in and sponsor and train the business units, the people, the app builders, the owners, on why this was good and the advantages of doing it. And they never invested that time. So they kind of built it and hoped that they would come, and now they're dealing with the challenges and the blowback of that.
You know, what you're describing, Robert, sounds an awful lot about human nature, particularly people in groups. So politics, right? Fiefdoms, different points of view. And the conundrum is that when you have a small group of people, you can often get them on board, but there's a certain cutoff point where when the group is too large or there's too many different groups that are too large, you lose control, you lose synergy, there's no overriding philosophy, it's balkanization, it's Europe in 1916. So
yep. It is exactly it.
Very difficult hurdles. I mean, these are problems that humankind has been dealing with for tens of thousands of years, if not longer. So tribalism, politics. How does a fleet organization maybe learn from what software development has come up with to combat some of these politics issues? You know, I'm thinking of agile methodologies and scrums and having short bursts and lots of communication and horizontal command and control structures, those sorts of things. Does that scale if, in fact, the POC of pure cloud versus everything else doesn't?
Well, you nailed it. How do you get this done is the question. How do you get some kind of agility through the organization to make this happen? There are successes out there. Whole organizations, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people being able to move, and we've been involved with them. And the best practices that we see today, Dana, are around allowing the business units, the businesses themselves, to select a platform to go deep on, to get good at. Right, so let's say that you have a business unit that's generating $100 million or $300 million a year with some service, and they have money, they're paying the IT bill, that type of thing, and they want a little bit more control. They want a little bit more the dev of the DevOps portion, right? They're going to provide much of that, but they still need core common services from central team. This is the most important part. They need the core services: identity and access management, key management, logging and monitoring. They need networking backhauls. There's a set of core functions that the central team must provide. And we help those central teams define those and govern those services. Short of that, as long as the business unit consumes those services, they use the access and identity process, they use the key management services, they encrypt where they're supposed to be doing, they use the networking backhauling functions, they basically set up the ACLs and separation of the services appropriately based on standards, and they use the automation to keep them safe around it. So there's automation that prevents them from doing silly things, right? Like leaving unencrypted S3 buckets, right, out to the public internet, things like that. You have software that does it. So what you do is you turn those tools over. It's like a playground. That's a protected playground. You say, hey, you can come out to this playground and do whatever you want, whether it's on Azure or Google or on Amazon or on-prem. But here's the services if you adopt them this way. And then you as the team can go deep. You can use API calls. You can use CloudFormation or Python or whatever happens to be the scripting language you want to build your infrastructure with. Then you have the ability to really let those teams do what they want. If you notice, what it doesn't do is overlay a common PaaS layer, which isolates the hyperscaler from your work. And that's a whole other food fight and religious battle, Dana, around lock-in and that kind of conversation.
Right. Imposing your will on everyone else doesn't seem to go over very well. So what you're describing, Robert, is a right-sizing for agility and fostering, I would say, sort of a separate but equal approach to start, but maybe even fostering some competition is who can do this better. As long as you can abstract to the services level and as long as you conform to a certain level of compliance for security and governance, let's see who can do it better and let the best approach to cloud computing win as long as your processes end up in the best mix. Is that a fair assessment of what you're getting at?
It is. And, people have preferences. Right? Come on. There's been a Linux and .NET battle since I've been in business, right? So everybody has preferences, right? So how you go about coding your applications is really about what you like and what you don't like, and developers are quirky people. I was a C programmer for 14 years. I get it. Once you get your world settled and you got your routines and stuff like that, the last thing you want to do is completely blow up my development stack and start over with a whole bunch of languages and tools that I don't know, trying to figure out how do I release code and test code and build up a CI/CD pipeline that's going to be something that I can be familiar with and tie my name to. These are really, really powerful personal stories that have to be addressed. And if you don't understand that, if you don't understand that the development community now has the power, they have the power, not central teams, that the shift has occurred to those that write code, that power shift is monumental in the ecosystem. And you've got to pay attention to that. If the people don't feel like they have a choice in that place, they will go around you, which is where the problems are happening.
Yeah, I guess I see it just a touch differently because I think the power has always been there with the developers. It's just that now it's blown out of the development organization, and in fact, the power of the developer is seeped up into the line of business, up into the C-suite.
Oh, that's a good point.
Major considerations for your business strategy need to consider all the software development issues and not just leave them under the covers. So probably saying the same thing. I see the power expanding, but I think it's always sort of been there. But that begs the question, Robert, of what's the kind of person, the wetware, that can be mindful of a development culture and organization, their strengths and weaknesses, also understand the line of business concerns, also appreciate the C-suite strategies, if you're a public company, among them keeping Wall Street happy, keeping the customer expectations met, because those are always going up nowadays. It seems to me we're asking an awful lot of a person who sits at the middle of this, or is it a small team? It seems to me that there's an organizational and a talent management deficit, or at least something that's unprecedented.
It really is. And this brings us to, I think, a key piece to our conversation is that the talent enablement is well beyond how we've classically looked at it. Some really good friends of mine run L&D organizations, and they have consulting companies that do talent and organizational change, et cetera. And they are literally baffled right now at the dramatic shift in what it takes to get teams to work together. Now, we're seeing that in the more flexible thinking communities of, I want to say, the up-and-coming developing communities, the people who are doing business. A lot of these folks that start businesses today are technology people. And they may be in like the coffee industry, right, or in the restaurant industry, but these folks know technology. They're not unaware of what they need to do out there. So business knowledge and technology knowledge are mixing together. They're getting swirled together, and you can't live without one and not have the other. So, for example, a developer needs to understand the implications of economics when they write something for cloud. If they go and build an application that does not economically work inside the constructs of the new world they're going after, that's a bad business decision, but it's at the hands of the developer. It's really an interesting thing. Now, we've had that before, but then you had a whole other group put those restrictions on them, right? They say, hey, here's how much hardware you get, period. That's it. Make it work. Not so much the case anymore, right? So that has to happen. But then at the same time, you have an operational person there who's being involved with helping them figure out how to architect something that the developers may not understand. And that has to come together. We have a whole category. This is something new, Dana. This is a recent 2018 offering that CTP and HPE put together this year. We have a whole training track, what we call a talent enablement track, around the consumer of cloud. We have found that much of the organization's delays in rolling out this is because the people who are consuming the cloud, not the people who are building up those core services like I talked about, but the consumers, the business units, are not ready or knowledgeable on how to maximize their investment in cloud. So they get runaway bills, they get issues and stuff like that. So we're rolling out later this year this full talent enablement around those new roles.
So this is, in essence, taking the people who are in that line of business, decision-making, planning, and execution role and bringing them up to speed as to what cloud really means and what it can really do to them, and making them better understand how to use that new IT department, that hybrid IT environment, and then therefore be in a position of crossing that boundary and maybe even bringing teams together in ways that hadn't been possible before. Is that what you're getting at?
That's exactly right. Let me give you a for example. We did this for a telecommunications company about a year ago. They recognized that they were not going to be able to roll out their common core services. So the central team had built out, I think it was about 11 or 12 core common services like I told you about before. Security framework, server hydration programs like on Chef, and they had a number of their core essential services like identity and logging, that kind of stuff I talked about earlier. And they knew almost immediately when they started rolling out that the rest of the organization, the 11 other lines of business, were not ready to consume it. They had been asking for it, but they weren't ready to actually drive this new Ferrari that they had asked for. This was over 5,000 people, 5,000, that needed to be upskilled on how to consume the services that a team of about 100 people had put together. Now, this is not classic AWS architecture or security frameworks or classic ACLs and NACLs for networking, traffic, and how do you connect back and backhaul, those kind of things. That stuff, that's WAF, none of that stuff. I'm talking about how do I make sure I don't get a bill that's way out of whack? How do I make sure that my team is actually developing in the right way, in a safe way? How do I make sure my team understands the services we want them to consume so that we can support it going forward? There was probably 10 or 12 domains that the teams simply didn't even understand how to consume the services. So we helped this organization build a training program so that they can bring up the skill of these 4,000 to 5,000 people. Now think about that. That has to happen in every Fortune, Global 2000 company where you may only have a central team of 100, maybe 50 cloud people, but they may turn the services over to 1,000 people. So we have a massive, massive training and upskilling and enablement wave that has to happen over the next several years.
Well, thanks. That was a really wide-ranging but impactful and illuminating discussion. Certainly I've learned a lot. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We've been exploring how a large part of the disappointment with cloud-based business outcomes has to do with outdated behaviors and even persistent dissonance between what line of business practitioners can do and what they should do with their new cloud strengths. And we've learned why making cloud models meaningful business in terms of the benefit to the business rests more with the people and the change management and talent management of those people than just about anything else. So please join me now in thanking our guest. We've been here with Robert Christensen, Vice President, Global Delivery, Cloud Professional Services and Innovation at Cloud Technology Partners, and that's, of course, a Hewlett-Packard Enterprise company. Robert, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dana. I really did too.
And thanks to our audience as well for joining us for this BriefingsDirect Voice of the Analyst Hybrid IT and Cloud Computing Strategies interview. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host for this ongoing series of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise-sponsored discussions. Thanks again for listening. Please pass this along to your IT community, and do come back next time.